We do have some slides. So thank you for the invitation to be here with you all today. It's been a very warm welcome that I've received from this IIMHL and IIDL community. Been very impressed. I've not had far to come. Just over the pond from Manchester. We share quite a lot with our colleagues here in Dublin, including the inclement weather. And also psychological trauma networks. We've worked quite closely with some of the colleagues of who you'll hear later today across the two cities. Now, a caveat for this presentation is some of the content might be a bit emotionally challenging, so I guess this applies to the whole conference, that if you feel yourself getting a little triggered or self-monitor, then do take care of yourself, look out for each other. And I'm going to compress this session. It was scheduled to be a little longer. I'm going to try and shrink it a little bit so as not to put too much time between us and our coffee break. I'd also like to welcome our international colleagues who are also joining us via video link. Okay, this is Manchester. It's a city of the people for the people. This was exemplified last week when the painting up there on the left-hand side, a Lowry painting, was purchased by the city for the people with the help of a donor, because obviously the city couldn't afford it, £6 million price tag. But it's a famous artist, Lowry, and it now means that the people of Manchester get to see this art forever, for free. And it also depicts in the background, you can see pictures of the mills, and it sort of harks back to the sort of proud industrial heritage of the city that's known throughout the world. And this particular painting is about going to the match, because Manchester is also famous for a number of large football teams, including the current Premiership champions, Man City. The university, it's a young city. We have 100,000 students. It's a tolerant city. It's an inclusive city. And at the bottom there, you can see Media City, which is where we share all of the broadcasting across England with London, and the rest of it's all based in Manchester. Now, one thing that we do export globally and we're known for is its music scene. And just to give you a little bit of background context to the incident I'm talking about, as you've already heard just a moment ago, we're in the northwest of England. It's a large 3 million population city comprising of 10 metropolitan boroughs. Right in the centre, one of our music venues, a 21,000 capacity venue, pictured there at the bottom, the Manchester Arena. It's the busiest music venue in Europe. In the area that you can see on the far right, the foyer area, known as the City Room, that is one of 3 egress points from the venue, taking people to their cars in the car park and taking them to the train station. On the 22nd of May, a suicide bomber detonated an improvised explosive device, killing himself and 22 children and young people as children and parents were leaving the concert. Hundreds more were physically injured, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the thousands who were psychologically impacted. Now, you've got to think about if this happened in your city, because it has happened in lots of your cities, and some of you, it hasn't happened in your city, is what would you do in your current job role, your position, your influence, your networks? How would you contribute to the response? Now, at the time, I was a clinical lead of a specialist psychological therapy service focusing on military-related trauma that was regional, and I had about 6 years' experience under my belt of treating the psychological sequelae of improvised explosive device exposure. So quite quickly, I was one of those people that kind of felt an obligation, felt a duty, put my hand up and said, look, I think we've got some ideas of what needs to happen here. Now, one of them I borrowed from colleagues from London, who, after the 7/7 transport terror attacks in 2005, they had a bit of an outreach program where they tried to follow people who were caught up in the explosions and find out how they're doing and assess them for psychological injury and get them treatment. We wanted to do something a bit bigger and a bit larger scale, because we're also interested in who actually is doing okay. So we made it like a public health screening where we wanted to find out not just who was struggling, but actually who was doing okay and why was that? And actually, if we track them over time, do they carry on being okay? So we did this outreach and screening. We were quite fortunate that this happened at a ticketed event. That gave us a bit of a head start once we got over some GDPR issues of actually communicating directly with all of the ticket purchasers. We used other methods to try and reach as many people as possible who we thought might be impacted. We wrote some algorithms. We did it using technology. It was an online portal. People logged into it with the PDF link that we'd emailed to them. They completed some validated psychometric measures, and then the algorithm helped us to determine who needed the limited capacity to conduct the assessments. Because I knew that we didn't have enough trauma therapists in the city region to be assessing up to 21,000 individuals. So we used some triage screening tools, first of all, to help us decide who gets assessed. And then obviously on the back of this, all of those that were identified in clinical need, we put into clinical services. Now, I suppose one of the take-home messages from this session is this diagram, and that is, as you can see, for everybody who was killed at the arena, more than 10 times as many people in the small environment were physically injured. And then of everyone who was physically injured, more than 10 times as many people were psychologically injured. So it's more than just focusing on the life and limb-saving element, which I think in England we feel we're pretty good at within the NHS. It's about thinking about the psychological impacts, which are much bigger and go on for a much longer period of time. You might notice on the right-hand side there that only 20% of people who were psychologically impacted actually came from that city region. Most people travelled a long way to come to our city to enjoy the most northern gig of this particular artist from America. We had over 560 whole family units that we ended up supporting. This was intergenerational trauma. We were talking about young children, 8 to 10-year-olds, going to their first pop concert, being brought by parents and maybe dropped off by grandparents. And we had more than 1,000 children that we supported. Up to date, we've supported almost 4,000 individuals. And I think one thing that the data of tracking and repeating this is that we kind of now have an understanding of some people who seem to be okay in the early days don't stay okay. Some of them deteriorate, and it might be a year later, it might be 2 years later, often at transition points, such as maybe starting university or experiencing another setback in their personal life. Also, people who start off highly symptomatic, some of those recover rather well. And the one thing we can say statistically that was significant from this first 3 years worth of data we've analysed is that those that come forward sooner and get the help sooner tend to be much less complicated and recover much quicker. So one take-home message is try and tackle the psychological needs as soon as you can. Make it part of your emergency plan. The other group of individuals who are very slow in coming forward and asking for help were the professional cohorts, the emergency responders, the hospital staff, who did struggle, but weren't always good at asking for the help. So what was the psychological impact? All of the obvious things as you'd think about. And when we think about the psychological trauma, it's not always obvious. We shouldn't assume what the trauma is for the individual. Some individuals, the trauma was obviously witnessing the carnage of an explosion like this in a small space. But for others, it was, think about the family whose children exited through one exit into the city whilst the parents exited in another exit, and they couldn't get hold of each other for 2 hours and they didn't know what had happened to each other. Think about the off-duty nurse who stepped over injured people to save their own child, as you would as a parent, who then struggles with the guilt and the shame of, I had skills that had I stayed, I could have maybe prevented some loss of life. And then there's all of the other people involved. In terms of trauma, we had the disaster victim identification officers who were literally on their hands and knees and using tweezers to pick up body parts as part of the investigation and as part of the humanitarian process. We had the CCTV operator who had to watch this happen and had to stay stationed where he was and repeatedly watch it again and again whilst law enforcement were trying to piece together what had just happened. And then we had the public inquiry where lots of other people were exposed vicariously to the information, everything from the paralegals who had to read post-mortem and witness statements and listen to the sound of the explosion repeatedly to build a case as to try and work out whether anyone was at fault. So don't underestimate psychological impact. It is profound. We had people who were teenagers who took to sleeping in their parents' beds and turning down offers of going to university. We had parents who refused to come back into Manchester City. We had parents who stopped going to work because of the phobic trauma reactions, and that led to a loss of income, and it led to loss of housing for some people. So, you know, the psychological impact is huge, and we really need to pay attention to it. In addition to getting people therapy where it was indicated and getting them psychological support, we also listened very intently to what the people were asking for and what they were telling us. Now, schools were a big source of support for a lot of the children and young people, so we went out to the schools, we gave them some information about psychological first aid principles and what you should be saying and how you can approach the children, and maybe things to consider when you've got your emergency fire alarm and things that might be triggering. And we used to bring them together for these education conferences, so as those schools that were a bit more forward thinking could kind of demonstrate what they're doing and help the other schools who were less interested in supporting the children kind of up their skill level. Now, if you're going to view any of the websites from this talk, I'd encourage you to look at the one on the bottom left, and that's called The Journey of Recovery. We worked with young victims who wanted to not just talk about their experience, but talk about their recovery journey. And we've now made an animation with the help of the We Love Manchester Emergency Fund, who funded it. And the young people got to interview the animation companies to decide who should film and produce this work. And it's now available online. It is sort of targeted for schools and colleges, but it's for anybody in the room. And we do know that other parts of the world have used it. And I would invite anyone here to look at it, and if you feel you can put the subtitles in your own language, please do so, and then please send us back a copy, and we can make this a global resource. We also did some visits because I knew it was really important for people within psychological recovery to be able to go back to the scene of the incident, because these were people who we wanted to come back to the city. We wanted them to come back to the next music concert, and so we managed quite creatively and jumping a few hoops to get access to the venue post-incident, not to film it, to show people anything devastating, but to show them how it looked now after the repair work. And we did some 360 video work, some virtual reality and augmented reality that allowed the young people to graduate to work out whether they could see some still pictures of the arena, and then whether they could habitualize to that emotionally, and then they would see some videos of the venue, and then they would put on a full immersion, all of which just led to a safe hierarchy of exposure before they went back to the next concert. And unanimously, that was very well received and enjoyed. The other thing we did is a lot of families said that they wanted to talk to other families with the same lived experience. They may have been the only child in their school who went to the concert. They may have been the only family from their town who went to the concert, and they didn't feel other people got it or really understood. So we facilitated a number of peer support recovery workshops that we called Family Days, where we had up to 80 individuals at each, usually in kind of football stadiums around most of the north of England, including Scotland. And we brought hundreds of people together to do some work together. Some of it was about peer support, some of it was around education. So I might take parents off in one room and do some psychoeducation with them about how to talk to your children. The children went off with the children and young people's clinicians and did some work about how to communicate your needs to your parent, because we find in these systems that everyone is looking to protect everybody else. The parents don't want to talk about it in case the child gets upset. The child doesn't want to raise it because they know it makes mummy and daddy cry. So these images are actually recovery boxes, resilience boxes, where young people were encouraged to put in things like their favourite music and scents and sensory materials, things that they could access to self-soothe at challenging times. And you might not be able to make out the top image on the right, but there's little tiny bees, and these are bees of hope. And we got the idea from after the Boston Marathon, another domestic bombing incident happened 3 years prior to Manchester. We received some gifts which were like luggage labels where young people caught up in Boston sent to Manchester and said, you know, you will get past this, we're 3 years on and it does get better. We took that idea, we developed it, we ran with it, and now the Bees of Hope have travelled to other European cities where there's been similar disasters. So vicarious resilience is really quite powerful. So last couple of slides really, some further learning points. You will get a stratification of victims. Now some of that is imposed by us. I'm guilty of that. I stratified people into those who were subclinical and those who were mildly affected, severely affected, etc. But also amongst them as a group of affected persons with lived experience, they self-stratify, and we had a kind of natural hierarchy developing where the bereaved families were at the top, and those with physical injuries didn't feel as deserving of help as those who had lost people. Those with mental health impacts didn't feel as deserving as those with a significant life-changing physical injury, and they kind of ended up getting the system to operate in a similar way. So the police would only communicate after they had communicated with the bereaved families, so the family liaison officers, and then they would tell the injured families, and then they'd tell the psychologically impacted. So sometimes it's client-led, sometimes it's service-led, so just be thoughtful about how you might approach the stratification. There's a stratification within family units, because sometimes there was, let's say, a mother who took a daughter to the concert, and then the father who was the designated driver or who was at home babysitting the smaller children. Not babysitting, it's what parents do, right? There was dynamics and conflicts because, you know, wives were saying, well, you weren't there, it's just me and the daughter, so we kind of come first. And we ended up putting on some groups for dads and other family members because they felt excluded from the process because they weren't there. The order of things is really important, and again, if you have any influence over the order of things, I want you to think about what you would do. So, for example, what's the order in which the deceased's bodies are removed from the venue? Families want to know. Was my child left there till last? Somebody has to be last. How is that decided? Whose post-mortem gets done first? Who gets to find out first about their loved one? So the order of things is really significant. Who gets named first on the memorializations? Who gets named first when the media list the 22 names? And who's at the end? And, you know, because it matters. The other take-home message is, as I've kind of hinted, the psychosocial tail is much longer. We're 5 years post-incident and we are still getting new referrals every week. You'd never know when somebody might ask for the help related specifically to this incident. And if you're worried about life-saving, then you need to pay attention to mental health, because as we've heard about the suicide statistics already today, it's the same for people caught up in these type of incidents. We had several hundred people for more than half the days of the week contemplating taking their own life just because of their involvement in this incident. Had we not done this outreach and screening, we wouldn't have identified more than half of them because they didn't have any professional help. So if you really want to reduce the loss of life from an incident, you need to do the psychosocial follow-up and reduce suicides. Messaging and communication is vitally important. So you'll hear in a moment, I'm going to play some video clips from our civic leaders, and they talk about resilience and recovery and the importance of getting back to business quickly, and, you know, solidarity, and the city is a strong city and we won't be defeated. And all of that's really important, and it was necessary to get businesses back to business. But if you're the one who's coming out of a coma a month later and you're just seeing all of these messages about we're over it, the terrorists haven't won, how does it make you feel? It doesn't give you permission to have the struggles that you've actually got, which led us to have a campaign, the kind of It's Okay Not to Be Okay campaign to encourage those with psychological impacts to come forward no matter when it was right for them. A controversial issue, but it happens at all major incidents, is you'll get a small number of individuals for various reasons who might either embellish their involvement in the incident as to, oh yeah, I was saving lives, when actually the CCTV footage shows that they'd left the venue pretty quick, all the way through to sheer fabrication. Some of the fabrication is quite easy. So we had a woman who was claiming compensation for her and her 2 children. And then it turned out that not only was she not at the concert, she wasn't even a parent, didn't have any children. That's a clear case for the authorities to just prosecute. But then there's other sort of softer, more complicated levels of embellishment and fabrication, including, I can think of some individuals who, I can think of one family, they cancelled their appointment for psychological therapy. When we asked them why that was, they said, oh, because we've got a media interview, which is an article in the media talking about the lack of mental health support following these incidents. And it's really detrimental, because if you believed everything you read in the media about the lack of support available, it would put people off, and it enrages people and outrages people. But there was a huge amount of support available, so think about how you might manage that. It's important to have a legacy after these things. We want to, if we're building something like we built the Resilience Hub, we wanted to contribute to wider psychological trauma. So we got permission to establish it on the back of the incident, even though it wasn't funded for the first 6 months. But once it's built, you don't want to lose these things. So if you've got something similar, or if you're thinking about building something similar, try and keep hold of it. We ended up building up great relationships with our law enforcement colleagues, and we now feature regularly as part of their family liaison officer training. We do psychological trauma training for all inspectors and sergeants. We assist in new operations, so when there's a new large-scale operation and they need to induct new detectives into it, like, I don't know, let's say a large-scale sexual abuse scandal or something, we teach them how to look after their own psychological safety at work and to mitigate against vicarious trauma. We also do operational case support, so when there's huge things that, there's the one happening at the moment in one of the Manchester courts, we'll support the process. We also took on a contract called Trusted Relationships, which started off as a Home Office contract, where we send in psychological clinicians into complex safeguarding teams involving police, housing, social services, to try and stop young people getting groomed into sex trafficking or groomed into gang violence, so it's now part of the Violence Reduction Initiative. We supported the public inquiry. Now, other inquiries have had support present, like Grenfell, like Hillsborough, but we really went to town on it, and we kind of built it as a trauma-responsive public inquiry, the first of its kind, certainly in England. And it was everything from the rooms that we used, the building, we knocked down walls, we thought about the environment, we trained up the lawyers, in their language, and we did have on-site support. And another difficult phase for us is that in the next couple of weeks we're going to get the publication of Volume 2 of the findings from the inquiry, which again will act as a trigger to lots of people in the population. One thing I'm particularly proud of is the Wheel of Manchester Fund. It was the emergency fund. It raised more than £23 million for those affected. And after some lobbying, we got invited to come and speak to their board and convince them, and by doing so, made it the first emergency fund that made financial gifts available for psychological injury. So we finally kind of raised that parity, that psychological injury people needed some help financially. It wasn't just the bereaved families and the injured. My last slide is that obviously we've had COVID since, and like many of you, you've responded to COVID. We already had a system that did a lot of things around peer support, advice and consultation, and direct service delivery, and we ended up getting asked to help with the NHS response initially to look after health and care workforce who are under a lot of pressure. And on the back of the Manchester model, we've now rolled out over 40 wellbeing resilience hubs supporting staff. That's only one of our work streams that we do in Manchester, but obviously that's kind of a good news story. Thank you all very much for your time.